Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like Throughout History in the Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining me is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He offers and personally provides both public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Mass. Currently, the communities that he has selected for this year's series of tours include Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst. His tours spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as parks and streets, and also a few chosen historical houses. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the burial grounds located in the community of Granby, Massachusetts. Describe the cemeteries within the border of Granby.
There's two cemeteries within Granby, and they go by the names of West Street Cemetery or West Cemetery. They were both of them Protestant cemeteries. And there's also the North Cemetery, also known as the Bachelor Street Cemetery. And the North one was found in 1764. So that was the earlier one. And along the way, we're going to talk about the origins of these burial sites. And we're also going to talk about what the Catholics had to do. There's no cemetery for Catholics in Granby. And what about other groups outside of Protestants and Catholics? Now, these two cemeteries, one's a tiny one that is along Bachelor Street, and the other one's much larger. It was considered to be the one for most of the people around Granby. And we're going to talk about its origins.
And where are the original burial sites of Granby's people?
All right. So the first one was the North Cemetery on Bachelor Street, made in 1764. It was probably made by the Baptist denomination. They left Hadley trying to get away from the Congregationalist denomination, who they considered oppressive, and they wanted their own religion with a church and, of course, a cemetery. And Reverend Clark stayed in Granby only a few years, but he probably brought land there for the church and his home, and probably for a cemetery. And the first burial there was a Levi Clark, and that was his son who died at 1 year old. But he died in Wilbraham, and since the Clarks had land back in Granby, and they wanted to start a new cemetery there, they put their son there, and then they put their daughter there a couple years later, and so that's why the North Cemetery started. Now, the West Street Cemetery, also called the West Cemetery, which is near the corner of West Street and Amherst Street, that was started in the year 1769. Granby itself as a town started in 1868 when it went away from South Hadley, and it needed a cemetery. And so it had a big plot of land that it bought from a local farmer, and onwards it went. And you can see the old burial stones in that section in the way back of this. So when you enter off of West Street, you have to keep going towards the back to see those.
And quickly, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org, and there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each tour, as well as photos and text of the historical sites as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours made for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. And so getting back to our interview, where are the Catholics of Granby buried?
They're buried, for the most part, in South Hadley, and it depends upon which ethnic group you belong to. And so, for instance, the Irish are mostly buried in the St. Rose Cemetery of South Hadley. The French Canadians are mostly buried in Notre Dame Cemetery of South Hadley, but also at the Precious Blood Cemetery. And the Polish ethnic group is mostly buried at the Mata della Rosa Cemetery. And since Granby didn't have their own Catholic cemetery, they went to the nearest one. Not many communities around the area had the Catholic cemeteries. Amherst and Belchertown didn't have them. All right, so Granby was using the closest ones, and they had large ones in South Hadley, and that's what happens. Now, the Polish had to use the back of the Notre Dame cemetery for a while. So if you see a Granby death record before 1934, it might say, for a Polish person, Notre Dame Cemetery in South Hadley. That means it was put in the very back, and now it's part of the Mata della Rosa Cemetery. So don't get that confused. And that little slice of land is towards the back to the left side of a large maintenance building in Mata della Rosa Cemetery. In the St. Rose Cemetery, you have a lot of the Irish people. And if you go into the left-hand side, there's a lot of the old burials there. In Precious Blood, a lot of the old burials are towards the back and some towards the left. And then in Notre Dame, they're scattered around, but mostly towards the front. So you should check out, if you're doing genealogy or local history out of Granby, you should check out these cemeteries, get to know them well, check out the death records, see what they say, and ask the cemetery offices where is a stone. And also check the obituaries, make sure they're in a given cemetery. Because cemeteries won't always specify it exactly, but the obituaries might help. You know, if you can't find them, just check around the cemeteries yourself by eye, or check the records of the cemetery office, and you'll find your relative.
And where are the other groups of Granby buried?
Okay, the Jewish religion, they would have gone to one of two synagogues that were in Holyoke, Massachusetts, the Sons of Zion and the Rutfi Shalom. And those two cemeteries for those congregations are both in Chicopee, the Sons of Zion Cemetery and the Rutfi Shalom Cemetery. So check out those cemeteries. Next, their synagogues would have been in Springfield or in Amherst, so most likely Granby people would have been going to the ones in Holyoke. Now,
So describe the cemeteries of Granby.
oh, easy, because there seems to be only two of them, but it's a lot more complex than that. And I'm giving a presentation this year in 2024 called The Burial Grounds of Granby and South Hadley. And you can imagine if you have two cemeteries in town, maybe there's something else going on. And what else is going on is that you have Catholics in town, and where are they going to be buried? Well, they're going to be buried in South Hadley, sometimes in Holyoke. And I'll describe that along the way. But the two cemeteries that are in Granby, well, there's the North Cemetery, that's on Batcher Street, and right off, believe it or not, it's the oldest one in Granby. How can that be? Well, I think what happened is the Baptist denomination wanted to get away from the Congregationalists in Hadley, and so they came out to this section of Granby when South Hadley first tried to break away from Hadley, and successfully. When it did so, it set up its own community of Baptists in that area, and people from Belchertown also joined in. And that's what Baptists always did. Remember, Roger Williams tried to escape from the Boston area, and went to Rhode Island to set up his Baptist denomination. And Baptists always escaped from people. A group escaped from Chicopee and went out to South Hadley. A group escaped from Hadley and went out to Granby. A group escaped from Springfield and went out to East Long Meadow. Another group escaped from Springfield and went to Holyoke. And they do it over and over again, set up their own church, and of course you need a cemetery. And the other cemeteries in town is the West Street Cemetery, much easier to understand. When Granby was first chartered as an official town in Massachusetts, it needed to have a meeting house, which was a church, and then also needed a cemetery. So in 1768 it became a town. 1769 it got its own town cemetery. And so you have these two cemeteries, but I said the topic is very complex. What about the Catholics and maybe even the Jewish people? And then also, where would the burials be in Granby? Since there were people in Granby almost from the start of South Hadley in 1721, where would the people be buried from that very old date? And why aren't there more cemeteries developed?
And where are the Catholics buried?
The Catholics are buried from Granby and South Hadley because that was the nearest group of cemeteries. And almost all those Catholic cemeteries in South Hadley are based upon churches in Hoyle. But Granby people attended churches in Hoyle because those are the nearest Catholic churches. When you have a parish, those parishes are official. And Granby had parish or part of the parishes of Hoyle. And so, thus, they're buried in the cemeteries where the Holy Church, Catholic churches were, and that's in South Hadley. And so, for instance, the Polish of Granby were mostly buried in the Mata della Rosa, which before 1934 was part of the Notre Dame Cemetery. Now, what about before 1890 when there was no Notre Dame? Well, they were buried in the St. Rose Cemetery or the Precious Blood Cemetery of South Hadley. Well, what about the French Canadians? They would be buried in the Notre Dame Cemetery, and before that, in the Precious Blood Cemetery, and before that, in the St. Jerome Cemetery. Now, what about the Irish? Well, the Irish came first to this area pretty much. And where are they buried? Well, they'd be buried mostly in the St. Rose Cemetery, especially if they went to church in St. Patrick's Church, South Hadley. And some of them, even before that, would be at the St. Jerome Cemetery. All right, so the Catholics of Granby had plenty of cemeteries. They're just the next community onwards.
And really quick, before we continue with our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information, or if you're interested in signing up for any of his various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as getting back to our interview. Where are the very old burials of Granby?
All right, so South Hadley and Granby were settled in 1791 when settlers from Hadley got permission to settle in that region. And so from 1791 to the start of the first cemeteries in Granby, that would be 1721 to 1764 and 1769, those first two cemeteries. So for about 43 years, where were people from Granby being buried? Well, most of them were buried in the old South Hadley burial ground, which doesn't really exist anymore. There's one person left in there. Those were moved in the years 1902, 1903, and 1904. And when they were moved, they were moved, some of them, into Granby, but most were moved into the Evergreen Cemetery, which is close to the old South Hadley burial ground. And the moves in 1902 and 1903 were a move where the family of the deceased would show up and they would say, can you take this body and this stone and move it to this cemetery, all right, and this plot in this cemetery? And the people that were showing up at that point were people that gave the town permission, and they also said, we want it buried in the family plot of Evergreen, which means they had to pay money for that family plot. But the movement of the body itself and the movement of the stone was paid by South Hadley. And they would say, oh, we want them just moved off to the side. And so in 1902, 1903, they showed up and said, can we have this little individual plot with a few individuals or family buried there? And that's on a little hillock on Evergreen property. In 1904, the town said, well, we're just going to bury them in the back of Evergreen. Now, how does it pertain to Granby? There are, I think, 5 burials in the West Street Cemetery that were from the old South Hadley burial ground. 2 I have proven. All right, so those stones and body were moved, I know for sure, in 1903 because they were on a list as being in the April of 1903 as being at the old South Hadley burial ground. But they were moved to a set location, not in back of Evergreen. That means they were moved in 1903 and into Granby, the family showed up and said, "Can we move these bodies here?" All right, they're on a special list made by a professor at Mount Hood College in 1903, Professor Sol. And for that reason, we're sure of two, and I'm suspecting three others that were prior to the 1769 birth of the West Street Cemetery.
And why aren't there more cemeteries?
Okay, why only two cemeteries in town? For instance, Belchtown has like 8 cemeteries. In most of Belchtown's history, Belchtown was about the size and population as Granby, all right? And then these other community, Amherst even has 4, right? Hadley has like 7, right? And South Hadley has a lot, Chicopee has a lot. Why so few in Granby? Very peculiar. Well, I think what happened is that the people in Granby are very individualistic and strong, and they wanted their own system, right? And sure, they had their 2 cemeteries, and why get more? In fact, the West Street Cemetery grew and grew through the years. Its old part was pretty small, and that part was all there was in the beginning. And then it grew in the 1880s and the 1910 Victorian era to have another strip added to it. And you can see that strip near the interior road. And then it grew from that point, from 1920 onwards, with another land purchase. So the cemeteries of Granby, well, there's only 2, but one of them grew greatly through the years with land acquisitions. And since there's only one meeting house there, and then there's one Catholic church, but that Catholic church came in the 1950s. There was no other denomination until much later than even that. There was no pressure to have another cemetery. And for that reason, you have a 2-cemetery town, which is very rare in Western Massachusetts. You would expect more family cemeteries because there's some remote parts of Granby. But you got what you got. Nothing like that developed. And you have this 2-cemetery situation.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our sponsors. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again.